In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using variables in Python. Now in Python, you're going to be dealing with a lot of data. And so a lot of times in our program, we're going to be working with all types of information and data and values. And sometimes that data can be difficult to manage. So in Python, we have this thing called a variable. And it's basically just a container where we can store certain data values. And when we use a variable, when we put those data values inside containers, it makes it a lot easier for us to work with and manage all of the different data inside of our programs. So variables are extremely helpful, and it's sort of like a core topic in Python that you're really going to want to know and master. So in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you guys everything you need to know to get started with variables. We're going to look at what they are, why they're useful, and we'll look at the different types of variables and the different types of data that we can store inside of variables. So over here in my Python file, I just have a very simple program, and it's basically just printing some text out onto the screen. And so this is actually a little story that I wrote. It says, "There once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. So this is a valid Python program. I could go ahead and run this program, and you'll see down here in the console, everything prints out and it looks great. So we have an awesome little Python program here. But let's say that inside of our story, I wanted to change the character's name. So instead of naming the character George, let's say I wanted to name the character John. Well, I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to manually change the name George to the name John at every place inside of this story where it's mentioned. So I'm going to have to go over here and I'll say, okay, John, I'm going to have to manually change that. And then, okay, down here, we're going to have to, again, manually type in John and change it to John. So in order to change the character's name, I had to manually go in and change it in both places. And now let's say, okay, maybe we want to change the character's age also. So in addition to changing the name, we also want to change the age. Let's make him a little bit younger. So why don't we say John is going to be 35. And so you'll see here I had to come here and manually change the age, and then come down here and manually change it again. And now that we changed it, like, it's going to work, it's going to be updated in our program. But you'll notice that in order to make that change, like, I had to look through the entire program, find where that value was, and change it. And this was only with 4 lines of the story. Imagine if I had a story that was like thousands of lines long, and we mentioned the character's name and age like hundreds of times. I mean, I'd have to look through each one of those lines and manually change the character's name. And that is not a very good way for us to do this. And so we can actually use a variable in order to store the character's name and the character's age. And when we use that variable, it'll make it a lot easier for us to put the character's name and age inside of our little program here. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create a variable for the character's name and age. And I'm just going to go up here above this print statement. And up here, I want to create a variable. So when we create a variable in Python, we actually need to give Python a couple pieces of information. The first piece of information we need to give Python is the name of the variable. So I need to actually assign a name to this container where we're going to be storing information. And so all I have to do is just type out the name of the variable that I want to create. So I'm going to create a variable called character name. So I'm just going to say character, and I'm going to say underscore name. And so generally when you're creating a name for a variable in Python, you want to separate different words with an underscore. So I have 2 words here and I'm separating them with an underscore. And now what I need to do is I need to put a value inside of this variable. So basically what I can do is I can just say equals, and over here I can type a value. So I'm just going to type out the character's name inside of quotation marks. So we're just going to type out John. So now we have a variable for the character's name. And below this character name variable, I want to create another variable called character age. So I'm just going to type out character underscore age, and I'm going to set this equal to the character's age, which is 35. So we now have 2 variables, one representing the character's name and one representing the character's age. So what I can do now is I can replace the character's name inside of the story with this variable. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So if we want to put a variable inside of this print statement, I'm actually gonna have to do a couple things. The first thing I'm gonna have to do is end off this text in here. So I'm gonna have to put a quotation marks here at the end. And you can see I'm basically wrapping this whole thing into a single like quoted line. And now I also have this text over here at the end, so I'm gonna have to put a quotation mark here. So now I have a bunch of text here in quotation marks, and then I also have text over here in quotation marks. Now inside of here, instead of saying the character's name, I wanna refer to that character name variable. So I'm just gonna say plus character underscore name, and I want to say another plus sign. So I basically am saying I want to print out all of this text plus the value that's stored inside of character name plus all of this text. And what this will do is it'll actually print out the character's name when we print this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this program, and you'll see down here, and actually let me put a space over here and we'll run it again. So you can see down here we still are printing out there once was a man named John. And so what Python is doing is when it executes this line of code, it's coming over here and it's seeing, oh, okay, they want to print out the value inside of character name. So Python's going to go up here, it's going to get the value, and it's going to insert it inside of there. So I can basically do this for every instance of the character name in my, copy this guy right here, and I can just paste it down here where the character's name is. So I'll paste this, and you can see now we're doing exactly the same thing that we did up there. I can also do this for the character's age. So I'm going to come down here and I'll paste in what we just pasted in, and I'm going to change this. Instead of character name, we'll change it to character age. And I'm going to do this in one more spot, so we're going to do this over here where we're mentioning the age. And again, I'll just change this to character age. And so now when I run this program, it's going to print out the same story that we were printing out before, but now I don't actually have to type in the character's name and the character's age. I can just refer to this variable. And the cool thing about variables is if I wanted to change the character's name, now all I have to do is change it up here. So I could change the character's name to like Tom or something. And we could also change their age. So I could change the age to be like 50. And now that's going to automatically update throughout our entire story. So when I click this play button, you'll see now we're using the name Tom, and he's 50 years old. So that's where variables can come in handy. And this can be a really awesome way to control and manage the data that's inside of our programs. With variables, you can also modify their values. So, for example, let's say that halfway through the story, I wanted to change the character's name. Well, I can just make some new lines over here, and down here, I can actually assign a new value to one of these variables. So I could say like character underscore name, and in order to give it a different value, all I have to do is just say equals, and we'll give it a different value. So let's say halfway through the story, we want to change the character's name to Mike. Well, now when I run my program, you'll see here in the first part of the story, it says there once was a man named Tom. And in the second part of the story, it's referring to the name as Mike. So I actually updated the variable inside of my program over here. And that's a really awesome way. You know, a lot of times in these programs, you're going to want to be modifying the values of variables. And so you can do it just like that. And so finally, I want to talk to you guys about the different types of data that we can store inside of these variables. So over here, I have the character name and the character age. And I'm actually storing what are called strings. So a string is basically just plain text, right? So the name Tom, that's just plain text. Down here, these guys are strings as well. So there's a data type in Python called a string, and it's just basically going to store plain text. So, you know, any text that you would have like in a story or, you know, someone's name, you can store inside of a string. There's also another type of data that we can store inside of Python, which is numbers. So in addition to storing text, we can also store numbers. So if I wanted to store a number, for example, let's say we wanted to store the character age instead of inside of a string, we could store it inside of a number. So I could just type out 50. And when we're storing a number, we don't need these quotation marks. You only need that quotation mark when you're storing a string. So if I wanted to store a number, I can just write it out like this. And in addition to using whole numbers, I could also use decimal numbers. So I could say like 50.5678213. And Python's going to be able to store that number as well. So you can store all different types of numbers, and we can also store what's called a Boolean value. And a Boolean value is essentially a true or a false value. And there's a lot of instances in programming where we're going to want to represent true or false data. For example, I could have a variable called like is male, and this would tell me whether or not someone was a male. In my case, it would be true because I'm a guy, right? So I can, actually this needs to be capital. So I could store a value of either true or false. And actually, if we were naming this in Python, we'd want to use an underscore. So I would say is underscore male, and this can be either true or false. So true or false values is maybe not something that you're used to dealing with like in the real world, but in programming, we're going to be using true or false values all the time. They're super important. So like I said, there's three basic types of data that we can work with in Python. There's strings, which is just like plain text, numbers, which would be like either decimal numbers or whole numbers like this, and there's true or false values. And these are the basic types of data. I mean, there's other types of data that we can use, but I would say 99% of the time as a new user and a new programmer to Python, you're just going to be dealing with these three types of data. So those are the basics of the data, and also with variables, and you're going to be using variables all the time in Python, so you definitely want to practice up and get comfortable using them.